Welcome to the CBSR webinar entitled How to Do Business Like a Canadian. I'm your facilitator for today, Leo Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director for CBSR, or Canadian Business for Social Responsibility. I'm really excited about this group that is assembled today. All of you bring such a rich background, and we're really privileged to have you. And we've invited a few featured guests that we'd love to hear from. But I hope that we'll also leave some time at the end to create a bit more of a free-flowing conversation. In the meantime, if you hear anything that prompts a comment or a question, let's use the chat box, and my job will be to make sure that all of your suggestions and questions are being brought to light here. So I'd like to maybe also just acknowledge that the whole genesis for this webinar really came about partly because we feel like there are a lot of really inspiring stories that are coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, some people think about, you know, all the bad things associated with a crisis, but I think it was a quote from Mr. Rogers who said, you know, whenever something bad happens, look for the heroes who are rushing towards the crisis. And I think that this was a really good opportunity to highlight the companies all across Canada who are real heroes in this story. Many of them are here on the line, and we're just featuring a few examples from within our network. And it builds on the Do Business Like a Canadian public engagement campaign that CBSR led last year. Some of you participated in that. That's terrific. And you know, on Canada Day this year, we'll have a resource that comes out for you. Watch for that. It'll summarize some of the campaign from last year and include some of what's happening related to this pandemic. Some of you who might be new to CBSR might also not be aware of the fact that CBSR is kind of like in a brand new era right now. We're really excited and fortunate to be partnered with the constellation that makes up the Globe series and Delphi. These are a series of, or a constellation of sustainability companies, conference organizers, youth organizations, and more that are bringing together some amazing content. We're really increasing the capacity, the scale, and the reach of the content that we're developing, and we're really excited about that new era. So you can learn more about that on our website, and also interesting to note that as we're developing content for everybody who is you know, social distancing and working through platforms like this, so are our partners at Globe, who have just launched Globe Virtual. I'll give another little plug for it at the end, but it's another really great platform. And if you sign up to our newsletters, or if you're already signed up to our newsletters, it's something you'll be learning a lot more about, because there's some great content coming out of that too. I just want to say a little bit more to sort of contextualize this conversation today, because this pandemic that we're facing, you know, it's something that is rapidly changing the role of business in society today. You know, up until very recently, it wouldn't have been uncommon for you to hear comments about the idea that shareholder supremacy, that the shareholder stakeholder is the most important stakeholder. But when push comes to shove, in an emergency like the situation we're facing now, I think it becomes very clear. It's almost like a clarity that parts the clouds to show actually stakeholders encompass so much more than shareholders. Obviously, shareholders are important, but in an emergency like this, we see very clearly the chain of command. It's about taking care of your employees. It's about taking care of communities, and everything that was ignored in the best of times really comes to bite us in the worst of times. inequality anywhere is a threat to the system. And so the health of that system really depends on people addressing some of the underlying causes. And what we're seeing now, if you look at a systems level approach to what's happening, things like poverty, food systems, climate change, waste issues, they're so much more amplified as a result of the fact that we're not in control of the external factors that are affecting us right now. And so I'm really proud that we have a number of speakers lined up here who can take us through some of how they're managing through this crisis, how their companies are responding to this emergency. And so I'm going to hand it to them in a moment and introduce our speakers. But before I do, a couple of ground rules. You're all muted. If you want to say something, there's a hand up button that you can click. But more importantly, please make use of the chat box, and I'll make sure to scan it and make sure that your comments and questions are coming forward. So let's use that effectively together here. And before I introduce our first speaker, which is Lynda Kuhn from Maple Leaf Foods, I'm going to just cue it up with a little video that we've got to share, and it's just a 30-second spot, and it's quite exciting because it represents a new program that Maple Leaf Foods literally just launched late last week. Lynda will speak a little bit more to it in a moment. But I'm just going to share my screen so you can see it. And here we go.
Empty schools, streets, and stadiums. This is what it looks like when Canadians do their part. But an empty fridge is a reality for millions of Canadians during this crisis. That's why Maple Leaf is donating $1 million to support emergency food relief, reaching people in your community who urgently need it. Staying apart doesn't mean we can't stick together. Join us in donating at aparttogether.ca.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lynda. I'm just before I pass that off to Lynda, let me just tell you a little bit about her. So Lynda is the Senior Vice President at Maple Leaf Foods, as well as she is the chair of the Maple Leaf Center for Food Security. Lynda's got such an impressive background and an incredible commitment to sustainability issues, to food insecurity issues. I'm gonna pass it off to Lynda here to tell you a little bit more about what Maple Leaf Foods is doing in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Lynda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lior. Everyone can hear me okay? As you probably know, we're a very large protein company, one of Canada's largest meat processors, but also one of North America's largest plant protein companies. We've been very ambitious over the past several years in thinking about how we create a more sustainable enterprise. And the culmination of that is a vision to try to be the most sustainable protein company on earth, and to raise the good in food. And I say that because I think it's critical to how we look at creating shared value differently in a more balanced way, and really helped set us up to be more responsive during this crisis. The video that you saw is a reflection of a campaign that we just launched with the support of Maple Leaf and the Center for Action on Food Security. It's a $2 million campaign, and the money is going to go directly to both Food Banks Canada and Community Food Centers Canada. And we're very optimistic that we're going to raise that money, and it's in addition to Maple Leaf kind of stepping up in this situation with more money and more product donations. And I do want to sort of couch all of my remarks in the fact that we are incredibly, incredibly fortunate to be in an industry that is relatively stable in this time. As you know, food is considered an emergency service, and you know, we have people going to work every day, and so we do think it's imperative that for companies and sectors like ours that are relatively stable, that we do step up and that we magnify the investments that we would normally be making by a considerable amount, which is what we've done both with food security and with other things that we're doing. Aside from food security, we helped with the Princess Margaret Hospital Foundation with a $2.5 million investment from Maple Leaf to launch a fund to support frontline healthcare workers across Canada. So Princess Margaret Hospital is working with health foundations across this country to assess their needs and to create a fund that can importantly support frontline healthcare workers, not just in their professional capacity, but equally importantly in their personal capacity and the strains on themselves and their families through the work that they're doing. So the goal of that fund is to hopefully raise $200 million, and those efforts are underway now. Thirdly, Maple Leaf has a lot of expertise in working in pathogen-sensitive environments because we are in the food business, and we are taking that expertise and providing it to our private sector partners, to civil society partners, to government, to think about how we can better protect our supply chains, our food supply chains, but also in other sectors in a very health-sensitive kind of environment and situation. And then lastly, one of the first things that we did was recognize that our people that are working in our plants and working in our distribution centers are really the heroes in the food sector, and we implemented a weekly bonus for all of those workers who are coming to work every day to make food for Canadians. And in addition to that, we've implemented extraordinary measures to try to keep them safe, thinking about how do you create social distancing in a plant environment, everything from staggering shifts and staggering lunch breaks and coffee breaks through to really heightened sanitation. And despite all these efforts, we have had some incidents of COVID-19 amongst our workers, and they are home and very thankfully recovering. But you know, we are acutely aware that we have a real responsibility to keep these people safe. And there are daily calls going on with our senior leadership team to assess the situation and how to respond to it very, very carefully. So lots happening both internally as well as externally. I just probably leave with a couple of thoughts on the fact that it's very hard to think about how to respond appropriately and strategically in a situation like this. And the fact that we had done a fair amount of work establishing the Center for Action on Food Security, having strong partnerships with civil society in the food security space across Canada, really kind of set us up to be able to be more nimble, to know who to reach out to and have conversations with those people, which were very thoughtfully about how can we help you think about how you kind of transform those kinds of social services in a time when they can't function as usual, and they've got really heightened demand. And the second thing is, having a CEO and a board that's very acutely aware of this notion of shared value creation as part of our ongoing business and how we think about business, so that when we think about how we have to respond in this kind of situation, it's not a different train of thought. It's something that comes very naturally for people. And certainly Michael McCain and the board have been very supportive of significantly enhancing our efforts during this time. So I'll wrap it up with that, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
Thank you so much, Lynda. What a great way to open this conversation. we do have a couple of questions, and let me pose one to you, Lynda, because I think it relates well to the mood and the time that we're in, and the effectiveness of what Maple Leaf Foods is able to do. But I think that this question more speaks to the communication of it, and I think that's probably a tricky thing, because while Maple Leaf Foods has some incredible response and results, and a a long track record as well. The idea of in terms of like how you actually communicate what you're doing and how you're responding while managing some of the perhaps sentiment that this isn't good timing or whatnot. How do you make sure that the communication is done effectively, it reaches a wide audience, but also it doesn't come across as perhaps more self-congratulatory or opportunistic? Can you speak a little bit about that? There was a question about that.
Well, certainly it's not the time to be self-congratulatory. I think the work that we're doing in the food security space is directly to elevate the work of our partners in that campaign, which are Food Banks Canada and Community Food Centres Canada, who are doing extraordinary work. So all of the social media and television is aimed at increasing public awareness of the issue, but also making sure that donations go directly to those organizations to support their frontline efforts. So I'd say, certainly in terms of our advertising spend, we are doing like many companies are doing. It's not an appropriate time to do advertising. Diverting that money to causes like the food security outreach that we're doing to elevate the profile of that campaign and hopefully raise the money that we need to support them. So I'd say it's now the time to focus on the doing, rather than talking about what we are doing.
Yeah, thank you. And one more question for you there, Lynda. Tom asks, there's so much that needs to be done during this emergency, and always more to do. How are you defining success, and how are you measuring it? Which I would think is really difficult because the need is just so great. How are you defining and measuring that?
Well, I think our focus has been in three areas. It's been with our frontline workers, and recognizing their work and doing what we can to keep them safe. So that would certainly be one. So we monitor that on a daily basis. Our social outreach is focused on food security. It has been for the past several years through the center. So that campaign has clear guidelines around what it is we want to achieve. So I'd say the outlier here is the $2.5 million towards supporting frontline healthcare workers, but so it's not been a typical approach for Maple Leaf. But clearly in this scenario, and as I say, being an organization where we are, relatively stable through this pandemic, we thought it was extraordinarily important to provide additional resources to support, the heroic efforts that are underway. So they're all measurable. They all have campaign goals, I think. You've got to try to figure out where your skill set is and stay focused and try to make the impact where you can.
Yeah. One more for you, Lynda. Melissa, who's a CBSR alumni. Hi, Melissa. She asks, if companies are increasing pay for workers during COVID, as you've talked about, and as Maple Leaf is doing, is that cost being passed along to consumers or being absorbed internally? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, it's being absorbed. It's we are like many companies incurring additional costs through this pandemic, through increased sanitation, through the worker bonus, through a variety of things. So those are it's not to pass those costs on to consumers. Those are costs that the company is absorbing.
And Lynda, I imagine that engagement with your staff at this time is a little different than it has been in the past. Obviously, the pay increase, I would think, is very meaningful to people. Can you speak a little bit to what is that engagement like with employees? How has it changed during this time of emergency?
Well, probably like all of you, we're all getting very technologically savvy. We have our room set up for Zoom and Microsoft Teams and so on. You know, it's yeah, I think like all of us, it's you know, you sort of go day to day, and you know, it's hard to think about the fact you haven't seen your colleagues, you know, face to face. In our case, it's for over a month now. So it's you find ways to connect and you know, try to bring some humor and some, you know, some of the personal side to it, to your conversations. But it's a very different world.
Yeah. And last question, and this one was asked by 3 different people, so I definitely need to ask you this one. People are asking you to elaborate about what you mean by shared value. You've referred to that. Can you speak a little bit about what that means to Maple Leaf Foods?
Oh, sure, yeah. So you know, really, when we you know, it was 6 years ago that we got very serious about thinking about how do we create a more sustainable enterprise, particularly given the sector that we're in, the food sector, and recognizing the social and environmental pluses and, you know, impacts of the food system. And you know, the prism that we use is thinking about how do we create shared value, and shared value is really this balancing act between creating business profitability, but doing it through the lens of you know, what are critical social and environmental issues that Maple Leaf can rally its resources around, and actually create business value out of that. So it's, you know, where you find the intersection between those things is the opportunity. And you know, one that I can talk about, you know, is very obvious in the market as well, is antibiotic-free products. So, you know, becoming a leader in raised without antibiotics pork and poultry is an example of shared value creation that's actually, you know, opened up a very significant market for our company in the U.S. because we are a leader in that space, and it's something that people want, and it addresses a serious public health issue about antibiotic overuse. And so, you know, that's one example of many, but, you know, environmental initiatives that reduce costs and waste, and, you know, I could go on and on. Those are all really interesting opportunities to create business value in a sector that's you know, very, you know, mature and with, you know, limited pockets of growth.
Thank you so much, Lynda. I think that was a good one to end on. And I see there's other questions. Thank you so much for your questions. We'll try and circle back to them. And Lynda, I'll probably send you these afterwards. And if there's an opportunity to respond to them, then let's try and get some more responses there.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you so much, Lynda. That was really great background. I want to make sure that we're also leaving enough time to hear from some of our other terrific featured speakers here. And our next one is Amy Sandhu. She leads the Sustainability and Government Relations at BASF Canada. Prior to joining BASF, Amy has a background in consulting for extractive industries, as well as the United Nations at field and headquarters levels. And so I'm really proud that we could speak to Amy on this call. You know, we just heard from Lynda at Maple Leaf Foods, who was announcing a brand new program that Maple Leaf Foods just launched. And similarly, Amy has really fresh news from BASF that she's able to share with us about how that company is responding to the health emergency. So Amy, welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for participating.
Thanks so much, Leo. I just wanted to do a sound check that you can hear me okay?
No.
Okay, great. So first off, just a massive thanks to Lior for convening this webinar and gathering such a solid group. I think I'm seeing like 120 participants within a really rapid time frame. So it really shows the solidarity right now. Quick intro about our company, BASF Canada. We're headquartered in Mississauga. We're a chemicals manufacturing company. We have approximately 1,200 employees across 14 production facilities and offices in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec. We produce chemicals for the automotive sector, agriculture. We've also recently acquired a seed business through Bayer, performance materials in construction and insulation, as well as home and personal care products. So just a bit of an overview of BASF in case anyone on the call is not familiar with us. So I've kind of divided my presentation, if you will, into three main areas: the what, the so what, or the why, and then the how. And it's relating specifically to this recent development for BASF Canada. So quick overview of how BASF is doing during this crisis. I mean, we are fortunate to be covered under all provinces, both at the federal and provincial level on the essential services lists, be it through manufacturing, chemicals production, and associated industries that were protected. So that was a result of quite a bit of lobbying through our industry associations, but also bilateral lobbying. We're clearly, recognized as critical infrastructure given the products that we produce that are also contributing to shortages for COVID supplies. So on that note, we've been able to continue to operate, and more relevant to this conversation is the shift of one of our sites production, the planned shift to hand sanitizer production. And this is at our Windsor facility, which is our automotive coatings and refinish facility. So, where are we standing with that? We were able to receive 3 licenses within 7 days for production. So that was 2 product licenses and a site license. And so that's kind of the what. I should also mention that we're doing additional activities, donating to local food banks to ensure that we're reaching vulnerable populations during COVID, donating hand sanitizer and masks, but the production of hand sanitizer, the actual manufacturing, that is the recent update. So now to the so what, or the why, and just to contextualize a little bit, the context under which we're operating. Supply chain resilience is really part of BASF's sustainability strategy and our overall business strategy. We feel the time is critical to offer additional support and solutions, not only to our customers, but to really demonstrate our commitment to the communities in which we operate and the wider Canadian community. I think we can all agree that we're finding ourselves in a highly disruptive period. We're massive, we're a multinational company, but despite our efforts in deep strategy to pandemic-proof or climate-proof or business recession-proof our operations, no amount of proofing can really keep us impervious to those shocks because supply chains are so integrated globally that it's impossible not to feel the impact. So yes, we're very grateful to be on those essential services lists, but I do want to paint a realistic picture that obviously we are being impacted because our customers are being impacted and associated industries that we serve are being impacted. So what is this context that we're operating in? Well, companies right now, I believe, are being really tested to ensure that their actions align with their corporate purpose. So BASF's corporate purpose is we create chemistry for a sustainable future. And in order to align with this purpose, we need to be, walking the talk, but we also need to be creating certainty for our employees despite immense pressure externally and despite operating in this uncertainty environment. So it's a very great challenge that, our leadership has taken on. And, just wanted to reference, what Lynda's comment about safeguarding, creating those safeguards for employees. We are doing as much as we can as possible because our employees are our greatest resource. So in terms of, protecting wages, ensuring health and safety at the site level. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'll focus a little bit on the hand sanitizer topic. So just a note on the corporate purpose. I'm sure many of the people on this call read the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink's letter to CEOs earlier this year, where he said, ultimately, purpose is the engine of long-term profitability. So along with, producing hand sanitizer, so that we can offer this as a donation to communities. We believe it's the right thing to do, but we believe that it fundamentally is aligned with our purpose and our business strategy. So we really believe that the key to absorbing shocks from negative externalities is rooted in both proactive and reactive business strategy, and managing risks in our supply chains, but more acutely, and this is perhaps why we were categorized as a pivoter, is being able to react and pivot very quickly as an organization, which requires mobilizing people, resources, and our operational resources. I think these kinds of shocks, these macro shocks that we're seeing, pandemics, natural disasters, climate-related risks, they really expose companies to vulnerabilities in their supply chain, and it's almost like they require us to hold up a mirror and look at our own organizational face. So, the results to business continuity during these crises can be highly detrimental, not only to your growth, but to your integrity if there aren't adequate safeguards in place, if there isn't the ability to pivot, and if there's no long-term strategy in place after the crisis period. So I think we can all agree that we're kind of entering this transition period into the new normal. Finally, it's very important to know, we're still operating in an environment where investors are watching very closely and making decisions based on what companies are doing and how they react during crisis times and non-crisis times. So, their decision making is happening through multiple lenses. Just to kind of quote a study by MarketWatch, they estimate that impact investing and ESG, environment, social governance, that framework that's being used, that accounts for about $20 trillion to $30 trillion of assets under management. In the U.S. alone, it's about $12 trillion of assets under management that are going through this assessment, this ESG assessment. So when you take that S in the ESG, we're really tapping into what we can do to add value and contribute to society based on our core purpose. So that's the kind of what and the why. On the how, I recall hearing the word supertanker organization once, and I can honestly say this is what BASF is. We're a massive organization, with global operations. Most of our decision making happens in the US when it comes to procurement or business decisions. So how we've managed to pivot is really through what I've identified to be 4 characteristics of our organization: agility, alignment with our purpose, something I'm calling the SWAT team approach, and then just sheer resilience. So we've tapped into all of our resources, be they operational and human, across the region and domestically, and really leverage that through a bottom-up and a top-down approach, strategic approach. So breaking this down, exactly what happened. Our president mobilized our EHS team, the Windsor site, our regulatory team, which includes our regional counterparts, product stewardship, government relations and sustainability, and of course the business regionally. The driver was really the site manager's agility as well, being able to, having the willingness to pivot production to respond to the critical need for hand sanitizer. Now, we were also operating in the context of decreased demand from the auto sector. So the site was able to galvanize the internal resources who worked very hard to complete rigorous product applications, site license applications. I mean, we had to submit it twice because there were new guidelines coming out with Health Canada. And so there was a lot of resilience on that side shown by the site employees. On the government side, we leveraged our existing relationships to ensure we were flagging our applications at every stage of the process. So, before we submitted, during submission, after submission, and now we're working closely with government counterparts to take a surgical approach and really understand where the high priority need areas are in Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario, where we plan to donate the hand sanitizer. As a general rule of thumb, our belief is that no one likes the friend that only calls them when they need something. So, we were able to contact, the Premier's office immediately to inform them of our intention. We triangulated, we ensured that the Ministry of Innovation, Science, Economic Development, Innovation is aware. The Ministry of Economics, Job Creation and Trade and Development, who's been absolutely instrumental in linking us with the Government Consumer Services, Health Canada, and other relevant government counterparts so that we're aligning with their procurement strategy. And, we've been able to do this and be on their radar because they're highly familiar with BASF. We're constantly engaging them whenever we have new innovations through activities such as site tours. We invite them to, our launch events, various business-related conferences. So when you have those relationships internally within your organization and then externally, those are built on mutual trust and they're deeper than just the transactional kind of what do you need, here we have it. So I think that, it opens the opportunities for discussions to be had with external and internal stakeholders in a more creative, meaningful way when you have those deeper relationships. So we really believe this is fundamental to who we are as a Canadian company. And that's why I believe that we were able to pivot. And thank you very much to everyone on the call for joining us today.
Wonderful. Amy, thanks so much. I think that's such an interesting and very live story. It's happening in real time, how BASF is pivoting, and I think that your role in particular is really interesting because you are in both a sustainability and a government relations role that you're seeing where the two intersect in a way that really positions BASF to be able to move quickly, built on the relationships that were established, and pivot in this way that you're describing. There's a question here specifically on that in the chat box that Donna asked, where she asked, how long did it take BASF to retool towards producing hand sanitizer, and was the capacity to retool built into the design? How much pivoting was actually required to meet the goal?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of time, so let me break it down. So in terms of time to acquire the licenses, it was 7 days. Now the planning had begun before we actually submitted. So I would estimate about 3.5 weeks in total, which is quite a short period of time, if you think about it. And in terms of design at the site level, that's a good question. I wish one of our site managers actually was on this call. I don't want to give an answer where I'm not giving due credit to perhaps the retooling that needed to be done. So I'll have to take that away. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure how much at the operational level we had to retool. But I do know that we did have the existing production capacity, and so we're actually assessing right now from a cost and availability of raw materials perspective, how much more we can produce. So the operational and production capacity is there from an operational kind of point of view. It's just about procuring the materials.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to move on here to to our last but not least speaker here, Chris Coulter. Amy, thanks so much for your amazing additions here. And again, there's a few other comments and questions. We'll make sure that that you have a look at that and are able to respond to it so that everybody's feedback can be heard and brought forward. But I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to our audience here Chris Coulter. Chris is on the board of directors for CBSR. In fact, he's our chair, so longtime friend of CBSR, and he's the CEO of GlobeScan. Chris works with leadership organizations to help them better understand and respond to shifting stakeholder expectations, build trust with key constituencies, and exert greater influence in shaping the future. He's got a lot of experience, 2 decades of experience in providing evidence-based counsel in the areas of reputation, purpose, and sustainability, and a real passion for building trusted and recognized leadership for GlobeScan clients. And Chris has a presentation queued up here, so I'm going to share the screen with the slides. But Chris, just before I do that, let me welcome you to the webinar. Thank you so much for participating.
Thanks so much, Leo, and thanks for everybody. Thanks, Lynda. Thanks, Amy, for the great overview of what you're doing and the important work you're doing. And it is wonderful to have all of us here together. So that's what CBSR is for, and it's good to harness the energy and community together. So I wanted to share with you just a little bit of work that we did a week or so ago, where we launched a report around purposeful leadership in a time of crisis. And the methodology that we applied was to look at a range of corporate initiatives that took place beginning in January up until the end of March across the world. And we're fortunate to have offices and vantage points in all regions of the world to see how would we classify the types of responses that are happening in companies across sectors and across geographies. And we found 200, you can go to the next slide if you want, Leo. We found 202 corporate initiatives, and then we categorized those initiatives, and it's there's a report, I'll put the link on in a second on the chat function that you can all review at your leisure. But what was interesting is that when we looked at it, we saw 12 different clusters of types of activities, and Lynda and Amy referenced a few of them, and they ranged from what you do inside the organization, employee treatment, all the way to how do you retrofit and create new innovative solutions to the challenge at hand. And then we stepped back a little bit and thought, so this is great, and as both Lynda and Amy have said, it's very challenging and tricky in the middle of a crisis to try and respond to it. And you can't, it's very, very difficult to do it if you don't have a purpose in place that both Maple Leaf and BASF Canada have in place. And that foundation of leadership and commitment and experience through sustainability, I think, has prepared them to be this responsive. But we do need to think, despite the middle of this, what happens next and where we're going. And so we wanted to look at our framework of leadership and do an assessment of the 202 initiatives that we've seen thus far across the world. So the next slide, Leo, can show you. And I'll just run through it very quickly, and you can, again, review the report later on. But in our framework, we have looked at leadership companies across the world for a couple of decades, and we see this consistent pattern. There are three big things that truly define what we would say is trusted or recognized leadership. One is a purpose, and the purpose has a couple of components that are fundamental: unifying idea and vision, and also the ability to project with authenticity through leadership what you mean by that. And that typically falls to a CEO, but I think it also falls to other executives like Lynda and Amy, as they just demonstrated. A second important piece is performance, and in performance we have a number of different aspects around how do you treat your stakeholders, what kind of impacts you have through your products and services and brands, and also what sort of systemic change, and I suppose the shared value definition works here too. How do you do a bunch of different things in a bigger scheme rather than more limited approaches? And the third part of this triangle is participation. And this speaks to internal and external engagement, and also collaboration to scale the impacts we're talking about. So I wanted to walk through in the next couple of slides just some best practice that we saw across the world. There are a few Canadian examples, but it's really meant to be a global scan, and then to assess how we're doing collectively. So the next slide, Leo, please. And the next one more, please. So on the purpose part of the triangle, we identified a number of examples of best practice in this that respond to the idea of a unifying idea and vision, which is very purpose-driven and purpose-led. And I'll just speak to one of these as we go, but GSK, their purpose is to help people do more, feel better, live longer. As a healthcare company, it's pretty natural to be involved. And they have been very dramatic in their response and approach to the COVID crisis. So much so, they're now pivoting to next pandemic responsiveness across the world and trying to build systemic shifts around it. And that's a fantastic example. In India, Mahindra Rise, this wonderfully established company, their chairman has played a really important role as an executive leader, not just talking about what they're doing, but being a voice of calm and reason and hopefulness that was widely recognized in the Indian business community and beyond as a real exemplary example of being a thoughtful sustainability leader in a time of crisis. So that's really critical. The next slide shows the purpose side of things, and there are three different aspects. One being embedded across all different stakeholders. How do we actually review all of our value chain and try and respond in an expansive way, and as expansive way as possible? And the second part of the performance equation relates to what do you do with your products and services, and how do you retrofit things, as Amy was talking about at her plants, and how do you share some of your products and services with the world, as Maple Leaf Foods has been doing as well. And the third part is the systemic change. How do we not only respond to the crisis, but think ahead and make sure that our actions are in line with raising more boats and doing more fundamental shifts that we know we need to do in the social, environmental, and economic field. So the next slide shows a couple of best practice examples across the world. And when it comes to embedding across all stakeholders, Lululemon, I think, has done a really interesting job of not only focusing on their employees and their customers, but looking at their ecosystem, which involves small yoga studios, and helping them in this time of sequestration, ways to support them and make sure they remain viable through this process, because they're deeply hard hit. So that's an interesting and close to home example. I think we can all see and respect what 3M has been doing around their masks and providing them and pushing them through their global supply chain despite what's happening in Washington. And on systemic changes, the most tricky and most interesting aspect of this, I think there are a couple of examples that are great, but My Bank in China, which is a Jack Ma spawned initiative, led a remarkable level of scaled collaboration and looking to the small, medium enterprise sector across China and trying to find ways to support 10 million small businesses across the country as a way to buttress against the economic shockwaves. And that was a long-term sort of play and thinking that they implemented, which is really interesting. The last part of the triangle relates to participation. And the next slide as well, Leo, please, shows some best practice examples of engagement internally and externally, and also collaboration. And in Brazil and Argentina, there's an interesting online retailer, Mercado Livre, which began very, very early communicating about the right social mechanisms in this age. And they created some memes and around the elbow shake, which now of course is verboten, but early on that was better than a handshake. But they had frontline response and communicated effectively. And then in South Africa, the Minerals Council has done some really interesting work in a challenging region where there's much less infrastructure and healthcare than there are in a place like Canada. Yet the mining industry there have created their own hospitals beside the typical healthcare facilities, and they provided those very early on to the government to help respond. So these are all different examples of working together to drive bigger impact. And the next slide, please, Lyra. And so what does this mean? So we step back and we wanted to just sort of put a little bit of a longer term lens on this. And if we look at the entirety of the 202 initiatives that we looked at, we rated them on a scale of strong, moderate, or poor. And this is not meant to be critical of any particular initiative, but at a broad level, we're doing not a bad job on purpose. Part of that is that some companies don't have that unifying vision or sustainability strategy or lens through purpose with which helps them act quickly and act boldly. And that's a difficulty to do if you don't have that to try and respond at pace and scale. There's also, I think, a limited amount of executive leadership. Not that it's absent completely, but we need more leaders to speak about what is happening, how we're going to get through this, the need for greater collaboration, and also the need to begin to build back better. How do we take this crisis and learn from it and apply all of our sustainable development expertise to create a better society in the back of this? On performance, we've got some great stuff on products and services. The embedding across all stakeholder groups can be stretched a bit further. And then systemic change is our weakest challenge collectively. And that's not a surprise given how responsive we have to be in the moment, but now is a time to step back and think a little bit broader on that shared value lens that Lynda spoke to. And on participation, I think broadly we're doing a good job collectively, so that's an important green mark. I will pause there, Lior, because I know we have some more time to chat, but looking forward to that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, wonderful to hear those examples. And obviously, Chris has given us a good snapshot of the global landscape. And before we sort of bring it back to the Canadian landscape, because I want to end on a bit of a call to action here. And I'll just cue up Allison as well, because I'm going to involve you in that conversation. But Chris, there is one question, which is that there's a few questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time for them all. But one question that I'd like to bring forward from Tom here is you've talked mostly about some really great companies who were purpose-driven, so that they were able to respond in the way that they did. But did you, in some of your observations, see some pitfalls, some mistakes that some companies made as they were trying to position themselves in a helpful way, but perhaps missed the mark?
I think surprisingly, not a great deal. There are a few exceptions in different parts of the world. I think that's mostly from haste, and I think some of the tone some organizations got wrong. The question to Lynda earlier on about how do you communicate about this stuff is tricky. And I think that's just a sense of over-enthusiasm or not coordinating things enough. But broadly, I think people, the intention of the organizations that we had visibility around have done a remarkable job overall. So I think the only failing or the only critique broadly we can talk about is just not enough of looking towards the next phase of where we're at. And that's understandable, again, in the crisis. And I think we can think of this in 3 divisions. Right now, we're in the midst of the crisis and we're responding. The second phase, which could be 3 or 4 months from now, would be a rebuilding perspective. How do we begin to look through the lens of Build Back Better? And then I think later in the year, we're probably in a moment of reflection for all of us of what is the new leadership that's required with the new world that we're left with. And that's really difficult to ascertain at this stage. So I think we've got an A so far for effort collectively.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for all of that, Chris. I'm going to just share my screen again for one moment because I'd like to walk you through a brand new resource that CBSR is launching this week. You're getting a sneak preview of it here. And just before I show you, I'll just say that this resource that we're calling the Canadian Business Responders List was developed in collaboration with Upswing Solutions. So Alison Murray, I'll invite her to sort of have a bit of a last word on the webinar. But let me show you what it is that we've been working on together here. And so this is a new area of the CBSR website. And so cbsr.ca, and just click on Do Business Like a Canadian in a Crisis. Right now, there's some messaging around this particular webinar that you're all part of. But if you look down lower, you'll see the framing that we've collectively put together around protectors, pivoters, philanthropists, and pioneers. This is how we grouped all these amazing examples of Canadian companies. You've heard from a few of them here today, especially Maple Leaf Foods and BASF. But if you look at this list, you will see a really large list of companies who are also doing amazing things, which you can read a bit more about. There's links that source where the information comes from, so you can see even more information. And right now we have more than 120 companies or examples on here. Some companies might be in here more than once if they're both a philanthropist and a protector. For example, like what Maple Leaf Foods I would describe as in terms of some of their activities. And so you see it grouped in that way. You'll find BASF's example in here too, and a number of others. And then towards the bottom, you'll also see that we're asking you for help. And this is maybe a call to action I'd like to leave you with, is help us keep this list current by adding your company in here or a company that you know about, so that we can keep this list relevant, updated, and make this the definitive source for where companies all across Canada are demonstrating what it looks like to do business like a Canadian in a crisis. Alison, I'd like to give you the last word, both because we really appreciate you partnering with us to bring this particular resource to light. And I know that you are based in Atlantic Canada, where you've been working closely with a number of companies. Maybe you can share some of that perspective as well.
Great. Thanks, Lior, and thanks everyone for the fantastic conversation today. The background really to where this came from is that our shutdown in Atlantic Canada really started the weekend of the 13th of March. And immediately we started to see examples of companies locally and internationally coming up with solutions to support their stakeholders to help them get through the crisis. And in Atlantic Canada, we predominantly have small and medium-sized businesses. And while this is a part of our economy that has really taken the brunt of the pain in terms of shutdowns and laying off staff, I have to say that we've also seen some really tremendous innovation and resilience from many SMEs in our region, and no doubt nationally and internationally as well. So we immediately began collecting examples of how companies are responding, and in a little over a week's time, we had enough content to host our first webinar, which was a few weeks ago, to share a broad range of responses that we were seeing. And the purpose was really to inspire other business leaders with what they can do, very similar to what we're doing today. And so we developed the 4 categories of protector, pivoter, pioneer, and philanthropist as a way to really organize the examples we were seeing, and also to give some context to the different types of responses that are emerging. And so we're really thrilled to partner with CBSR to expand the tool that we developed, and to really make it truly representative of how Canadian businesses are responding across the country. So really encourage everyone to add your examples to it, and keep it as a live and growing document as we go through this together over the next who knows how long, hopefully not too much longer. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. And I think that what Allison has really brought to this, aside from some great thought leadership and proactivity here, is a really good perspective on what's happening in Atlantic Canada. I think that perhaps some of us who live in other parts of the country are not hearing some of the heroic stories coming from there. And so I think that if you look at every corner of the country, there are amazing stories to share, and we would like this tool to be a platform to tell those stories and inspire others. Just like hopefully you've been inspired by the amazing examples that we've had here today. We've reached the top of the hour. There are still a couple more people that I know are also on the line that are doing some terrific projects. And so for those of you that can stay another 15 minutes, I invite you to do that and maybe hear from some of those other stories. But let me, before we do that, take a moment to thank our featured guests here today. We had Lynda Kuhn from Maple Leaf Foods, Amy Sandhu from BASF Canada, Chris Coulter from GlobeScan. You also heard from Allison Murray with Upswing Solutions. Thank you to all of you for joining us and for sharing these amazing stories.
Thanks, Leo.
I'll also just say before we sign off, for many of you, that if you want to find out more about how we're communicating these great stories about companies doing business like Canadian in a crisis, then sign up to our newsletter. Not only will you get more information about this, but you'll also hear about future webinars, other great projects and research that we're involved with. We've got new companies joining CBSR, so we're going to be making some exciting announcements about that really soon, so stay tuned. And you'll also be hearing through our newsletter some information about Globe Virtual. So Globe, our partner organization, is launching a number of really exciting virtual conversations. And you can visit their website at globeseries.com to learn more about that. But of course, you can also stay in touch through our newsletter where we'll bring you more content like that. So help us communicate about that Canadian Business Responders list and add your great stories to it. That's it for the main content around this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And for those of you that are able to stick around for another 10 minutes or so, we've got some other really amazing examples that I'd like to shine a light on. And one of them is Mike Smith, who I see is still here. That's terrific, Mike. I'd like to just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what you're doing with small businesses all across Canada. Mike Smith.
Thank you, Lior.
And let me just say that Mike is also the founder of Impact Bridges, a really great organization out of Toronto, and a lot of their work has been with working with companies, many of them B Corps, doing some terrific work. So
thank you, Lior.
happy to have you, Mike.
I'd like to think of myself as a young Chris Coulter. So thanks, Chris, for your work and the work that I've been doing, particularly with small businesses, and a lot of my work more broadly with small and medium enterprises, is really thinking about the growth and impact journey. But when the crisis hit, where I found myself trying to understand the issues was what was the initial government response, and where were there some key gaps, particularly for small local businesses that represent the heart and soul of Canadian communities on main streets, our restaurants, our coffee shops, and really the work that myself and a growing volunteer coalition have been doing is to help save small business. So I'd invite all of you to visit savesmallbusiness.ca if you'd like to see the petition, which we initially launched with the website on March 22nd. And within 24 hours, more than 2,500 small business owners had signed the petition. Within the first week, I think we hit over 10,000, and it's now just past 30,000. So we've been engaging alongside other long-standing organizations, Canadian Federation for Independent Business, CFIB, and we've been really helping the government to understand what's happening across Canadian main streets, and ultimately what is missing and what's needed, particularly moving beyond debt as the solution that's been presented for most small shops that can't pay rent because their revenues have dropped 80 to 100%. Many have closed and laid off their workers, but their fixed costs remain. And so from the federal government, there's a need for more. And thankfully, after a lot of pushing on Minister Murneau and Minister Ng's teams, there was acknowledgement by the Prime Minister this morning that amongst the industry-specific packages that are likely to be announced this week, there is a recognition that small local businesses need help around commercial rent abatement strategy. And that's one of the key pieces we've been pushing for. So ultimately, I'm happy to connect with any of you further, but it's been a real journey of engaging with journalists, leaders across the country. And at this time, I think it's been a Team Canada effort that I'm proud to have played a role in initiating, and a great team, coast to coast to coast. And ultimately a lot of really solutions journalism focused people writing stories, CBC, Globe and Mail, Maclean's and others, recognizing that this was an issue that wasn't addressed to date, and is hopefully with our help and with others coming together, something that does move the needle and help to really stem the loss of our favorite main street shops, which quite simply, it could be decimated if we don't act fast enough, because rent is due May 1. So that's really what we've been pushing forward, and happy to answer any questions or connect elsewhere following up on this. Thanks, Lior.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm just going to unmute Diana here, if I can. Diana, maybe try unmute yourself. I'm going to introduce to you Diana Frost, and Diana runs a company called Coloring It Forward. And some of you might be hearing how in the midst of so many people being hit hard by the economic impacts of this pandemic, artists have lost their livelihood, and so this is one of many, I think, vulnerable groups in Canada who are not able to continue to make weight. I mean, some are finding some interesting ways, but for the large part, it's a community of creatives in our society that are really important to our country, whose livelihood has been cut off. Diana is working really closely with artists, but a really, I think, unique group of artists. And I'll actually, before I sort of steal your thunder, I'll let you actually talk about what Coloring It Forward does and how you continue to do work during this pandemic.
Thanks, Lior. So I run an Indigenous social enterprise. It's called Coloring It Forward. And originally, what I first started out doing was producing coloring books with Indigenous artists and elders. And the idea was to share the beauty and the wisdom of Indigenous culture with people so that they could learn the beautiful things, because I felt like in media, everything was always so heavy and negative, and I never felt like we'd get to reconciliation unless we also shared some of the beautiful things, some of the teachings that we can learn from to live a better balanced life and live better together and in respect of our environment as well, Mother Earth. And so when the pandemic hit, a lot of the stores that were selling our books closed down. And so then I had to look into, well, how do I continue to support these artists? I mean, a lot of Indigenous artists, not only are they, they're shy of coming into mainstream society, but a lot of them also live far away. And so it's been a struggle to kind of figure out, well, how can I help more artists and more elders at this time when most artists and elders, their livelihood is pretty much being decimated, because a lot of them, what they do is they go to events. They'll go to markets to sell their artwork. The elders will go and they'll do blessings at conferences, or they'll offer ceremonies, and all of that involves groups of people. And so most of them are just, their livelihood has disappeared. And so what I decided was, excuse me, to pivot and do more work online. So right now we're still pivoting. Some of us don't pivot as fast as others. And so we're building PDFs of activities and games and teachings and stories for people who are homeschooling. Right now we're building one as well for companies who want to send them out to their staff or their clientele. And it's basically, we're trying to generate some revenue for a wide variety of artists. So we're using artists from different nations and also elders. So it's taking more time to get the stories pulled together from the elders, because it requires a lot of review. So, but we are almost done with our with one of them, and so I'm hoping that this will that companies will be interested in sending this and doing a small investment, which will then be passed. The money will be passed on to the artists and the elders and give them a little bit of income going forward.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you so much for sharing that, Diana. I think that your example is already in that Canadian responders list, but I'll double check. And if not, let's make sure that we capture that, because what a great, okay.
I tried to add it yesterday, but for some reason it wouldn't let me, Lior.
I think we had a glitch on it yesterday. It was our sneak preview yesterday. Today is kind of like sneak preview 2, and we've just fixed that glitch, so feel free to add it. And we'll do a more formal launch of the resource a little later in the week, and so we'd love for you to help us get that to a broader audience. There's one more person that I have invited to say a few words because of the great example that she and her company has. And Joanna, so Joanna McDonald is the CEO of a luxury brands company called Piper & Sky. She'll say a bit about what they're doing and how they're pivoting to meet this emergency. Joanna just sent me a note saying that her video is giving her some problems here, so you might not see her smiling face, but I assure you she has a smiling face on the other end of that. And Joanna, please tell us a little bit about Piper & Sky and what you're doing.
Sure, thanks, Lior. Hi, everybody. So Piper & Sky is a Toronto-based luxury women's handbag brand, as Lior mentioned. And excuse me, currently we're working on 2 different initiatives to help with the COVID crisis and pandemic that we are experiencing And so we've really done a pivot within our supply chain. And the two initiatives that we are working on right now, the first one is regarding the production of small batches of fabric, washable and reusable masks. And we're really trying to focus on delivering these to the vulnerable parts of our society that are largely going unseen and unheard right now. So these shelters that support victims of domestic violence and human trafficking, they have a great need for protective masks. And so we have gathered together over 30 home-based artisans and sewists across Canada to make small batch quantities of fabric masks. And those are being donated to the shelters across Canada. So it's been a really fun project because we are employing our fellow Canadians at a time when so many people are off work and laid off from their jobs. And so it's been a really interesting pivot for us to tap into our supply chain and work with a whole new network of artisans and fabric sewists across the country. The other project that we're working on, again, has to do with serving the needs of the shelters in our country. And so there is a massive need right now for relief for the shelters that are inundated right now with emergency cases, with the large number of children off school right now, and also people laid off from their jobs. There's a dramatic increase in the rates of domestic violence in our homes in our country. And so what we're looking to do is connect hotels and condo developing corporations that have vacancies and that are operating right now with the shelters, such that we can transition some of those women and clients, residents, out of the shelters and into a transitional housing situation, and then take some of the pressure off the shelters such that all the emergency cases that come to their door can be served. And so we really believe in Piper and Sky that tackling some local solutions is really the best way for us to have an impact on this global pandemic. So that is sort of our focus, is really just trying to tap into the needs of the vulnerable in our society at this time. So anything that I've missed, Lior?
Well, you're doing some amazing things there, Joanna. Thank you for sharing it. I do have sort of one burning question, and maybe others who are coming across Piper and Sky for the very first time might have this as a bit of a burning question too. But typically, what your company does is sell luxury handbags. So I'm curious, because this is like obviously like a really amazing initiative that you're doing, but definitely not one that somebody perhaps would associate with sort of the luxury market, luxury fashion. Can you speak a little bit about like your sort of like personal philosophy of how you're making handbags that are really beautiful, but also pivoting towards an initiative that's serving some of the most vulnerable in our society?
Sure. So I will start by saying that we identify as a brand as being responsible luxury. And so what that means to me is that intercompany wise, we really, everything that we do, we try to do it responsibly. So that's through our supply chain, our material selection, and we do make luxury handbags with exotic skins and leathers. But we ensure that everything that we do, every step and every piece of the puzzle is done responsibly. So we do use wild American alligator. We use wild fish leather from South America. And we take the skins and leathers and we honor and cherish the beauty marks that they have from nature. And so we cherish and honor the imperfections in these wild species and the leathers that we create our product from. But we also believe in this notion of perfectly imperfect. And so there is beauty in being perfectly imperfect. And so that sort of extends to our philanthropic initiatives. So we, there's a perfectly imperfect element to the most vulnerable people in our society. So that's kind of where it extends for me, is that the vulnerable people in these shelters in our country matter just as much as everybody else. And so we just kind of want to shine a light on how we can help and how we can serve the perfectly imperfect in our world.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, Joanna. And I think that, one thing that this health emergency has shown us all is that, so many of these issues are interconnected. And within this pandemic, there are all kinds of pockets of stories of communities that are doing amazing things, also communities that need our help. I think you're serving a really important, vulnerable community. And there's other great examples on this line. Miranda, for example, if you look at the chat box, just shared in there that, the art of storytelling works with the Headwater Healthcare Center in Ontario and helping them continue their video communications using user-generated content and remote editing. She's got a link there where you can learn more about that. I'm going to do something a bit risky and unmute you all for an opportunity to have any sort of like final words, or if you'd like to share a comment, please keep it really, really short and concise. We're going to sign off in 3 minutes here, but just wanted to, if you have a comment, then be respectful of everybody else that wants to make a comment, but a comment or a closing thought, and then I'll open that for maybe just 2 minutes here, and then close this out. Lots of background noise, so if you have background noise, please mute yourself. Otherwise, you're all unmuted now. And anybody want to ask a question, perhaps, or share a closing thought? Okay.
I wanted to say thank you, Lior, for organizing this, and to everyone at CBSR. I think this has been very positive and uplifting.
Thank you for saying that. I see there's still communication in the chat box, so we'll leave that open for another minute if that's how you prefer to share your closing thought. Let me thank all of you so much for joining us. It's, I'm just seeing a grid of kind of a Brady Bunch kind of grid of lots of faces of amazing people that have joined us here today. I feel very blessed that that we could have such a rich conversation with such an amazing group of leaders from across the country. That's truly what you are. So thank you for being here today. Once again, if you're not already subscribed to the CBSR newsletter, please do so at our website. We're going to be launching that Canadian Business Response List. Help us get that to a broader audience, especially through social media. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks, Lior, and all the team.